We are going to draw a cat. As we get started, I want to go over materials. So I'm just going to stick to pencil today, graphite. Obviously, I always recommend having your different types of lead, having a couple of H pencils, meaning 4H, 2H, highly recommended, into your HB, 2B, up to 4B or even 6B to create that really efficient use of your tool, which gives you hardness, lightness, and then softness and darkness. So what I do is I simply replace my pencils with mechanical pencils. And what I do is I have several of them. In this case, I'm just going to use 2 of them because I could get a good range of value with 2H lead and then 2B lead. So that's what I do. I also have a couple of paper blenders or a Q-tip or just a little piece of paper towel or cotton. A cotton ball would be helpful. These are great because you can layer your blending of graphite and then come over with the harder pencil. Softer pencil. I also have this small, it's called a Mono Zero Tombow eraser, which is an amazing tool to draw light back into your drawing. So you're literally using it as a pencil to lift and erase material, kind of to draw it back in. And then I also recommend having a kneaded eraser, which helps you just lift and also create beautiful textures, especially with fur, for different uses as well, different techniques. So let me set these aside. And I'll be using these back and forth, just going over the techniques. You are obviously welcome to use the pencil and ink, or I wanted to show you really quick what I did with pencil and watercolor. So this is what we're going to do today. We're going to do the eye, obviously not in color. We're going to do it in black and white. We're going to do the eye, we're going to do the nose, and then we're going to do the full face pretty much. I hope you got the images. I will leave this one up on screen the entire time. So what is the purpose of today? We're going to get to drawing right away. I am going to split this page. This is my SAS sketchbook. Last we were in London. Here's Paris, and next we're going to San Francisco, I think in a week or two. So here I'm just going to split this page, composition-wise. I'm going to split this page, the top for the eye, the bottom for the nose, and then I'm just going to flip my sketchbook around and do the full cat in this side. So what are these drawings that I'm about to make? I want to call them sketches or studies. So first thing, having a sense of composition, I'm going to keep my hand right here just to get a sense of the middle so it doesn't get too big and then leaves me a little bit of room here at the bottom for too small of a nose. So up to here, I want to get a good sense, and the first thing is simplify. So what am I simplifying here? I want to simplify the biggest, simplest shape that I see. Now I'm working with 2H pencil. If you have anything lighter, you can. Make sure you keep your lines as light as possible, as long as possible. You want to develop the value as you go stage by stage, and switch pencils when you feel you need to as you develop layers of value. So the first one, the lightest, simplest, and biggest. So there is the thing that jumps out at me the most, which is the circle. But I want to think about this circle as a sphere, and pretty much all the way through. So what do I mean by a sphere? There's light hitting it. There is, I hope you guys could see it. I'm just guesstimating here where I see that little highlight and a few other specks of light, meaning the light is coming from this direction, which means we have a little bit of coverage, and I hope you could see it because this is going to be a big part of the drawing. It kind of comes in around. Think of a crescent moon where there's light on one side, shadow on the other. And in this case, we have the light just shining down in this area. But all of this is going to be a little bit of shadow. So as I begin to just interpret this, and I don't expect you to do this, I'm just getting ahead of, just a little bit ahead to show you where we're going. I want to make sure I have those white spaces, the shapes of them, and then just a quick measurement to get a sense of the pupil. So here I'm looking at, if this is my shape, what is the space between here and the bottom of this beautiful pupil? Now I want to start small, light, and as I begin to see how it behaves in terms of proportion, then I can make it wider, which is why you want to keep those lines light. As you sketch them in, then we confirm them. You make them a little darker. Now, I don't know if I told you this before, paper needs to be caressed. Think of someone just caressing your skin. And oh my gosh, that feels good. A baby loves that. Everybody loves that. So I want you thinking of you, the graphite, the pencil, caressing the paper. The moment you start doing this to the paper with the pencil, ouch. We want to caress it the entire time. What do I mean by that? As soon as you start adding pressure to try to get it darker, you hurt the paper. You hurt the tooth of the paper. And you can actually rip it. We all know that. So instead, caress it over and over and just layer and layer and let it build up with a lot of patience. You're going to get just such beautiful results. There's a thing with graphite. When your pencil drawings begin to get shiny, is because you've added too much pressure. Think of a paper as a mountain ridge. If you actually put a piece of paper under a microscope, it looks like mountain ranges. So what you're doing with the graphite is you're going over the top of those mountain ranges and you're dropping material. So you're just, think of snow-tipped mountains. And as you push down on the paper, you flatten it. So the less you push on the paper, the more you get that nice graphite paper texture that is just beautiful. But the more you push on it, all you're adding is snow on top of snow, or graphite on top of graphite. And what happens there is it has nowhere to go, no valleys to fall into, so it becomes shiny. So I got a little bit ahead of myself here, just trying to get a sense of the actual darkest element in my drawing. And what I want you to think about today in terms of sketching is stay as light as possible, as long as possible. Oops, I broke that rule. Well, it's still very light. Stay as big as possible, as long as possible, as we develop smaller shapes, and also simplest to more complex. So I'm beginning to look for more complex angles, which you notice how here there's a little bit of a overlap. And I want to look at the next biggest shape that I see, which is kind of the bone muscle structure where this eye is nicely resting in. So we're going to think of it as, the eye socket. So there's a little bit of roundness, an oval shape to this side. Now, how big? Always look at the edges. How far away? Is it all the way out here? Or is it just a tad in here? I think one of the safest ways is always to measure, look at it again, and then exaggerate just a little bit. I could always exaggerate a lot, but if I think it's here, most likely it's further out. We tend to kind of normalize lines, straighten them, or shorten them. And if you've ever done drawings where a figure and all of a sudden the legs or the torso is a little shorter, that's what I mean. How do we build those? How do we see those relationships? one of the safer ways is to think of exaggerating as you're building them up. So next thing I'm going to talk about is hatching. Notice the motion that I'm doing here. I'm doing parallel lines at somewhat of a 45-degree angle, kind of to fill in what would seem to be one of the darker shadow areas, building up the value. But I do want to make sure I notice the difference between the shadows, or for example, the darkness of this as compared to the darkness of this, and therefore the darkness around here. And believe it or not, darkness that moves in and around our subject, which we'll get to. So as I continue developing this, I'm going to build up big, simple shapes. I do not want to, that's my goal for today, by the way. I'm going to say it now. I want you to focus on the biggest, simplest things without getting caught up in what we call detail. If I get in here and begin to develop all the little things that I see and just forget about everything else, I'm losing my focus. What I want you to do is begin to build all the way around, all the way through from biggest. So what would be the biggest thing? Now, for me, it could be very different than what you see, what jumps out at you. For me, it begins to be kind of this shape, which is a light shape that is made of fur. So it has not a hard edge, but soft edges. But if I squint at it, all of a sudden I see how it gets very thin here and how it just arrows out this way, meaning it kind of becomes sort of a triangular point. Now, one thing before I start doing these hard edges, I kind of want to follow the direction of that shape. So I see that there's a sort of a movement, a rhythm this way. Obviously, I know it's fur, so there's even a little bit of curvature to it. But again, I don't want to stop and overwork the area with every single detail. I want to keep it simplified, thinking of as big as possible, as simple as possible, all the way through. Now, I do see a little variation of value in here, so I'm going to go ahead and apply that hatching method to darken this area that I see relevant. And notice how as we pick big shapes that become medium shapes that then become smaller shapes, it starts coming together. The only difference is we're looking at shapes and then we're looking at the value of the shapes. So how light or how dark. Now here it gets tricky. We have lots of little, it would seem almost like it's hair by hair. But if you squint and sometimes you close one eye and then squint, you kind of really see the shape of it. At least the bigger general shape of it. So I just feather out these edges. And because I'm squinting, I simplify the information. And I just kind of follow the pattern, follow the direction, without having to draw every single hair. So what it becomes more is a little bit of a little slower hatch pattern. Kind of like I did this here to fill in. It was just back and forth, back and forth. And you do, believe it or not, you do begin to stylize your own hatching method. And then we will identify it. We will know who did it when you begin to think about it that way. Okay, so I think I'm ready to move to my darker pencil, because remember what I said earlier, I want these to be study sketches, and it's not going to be a fully finished drawing in terms of, I just want to spend a whole hour on this eye. You could, by the way. If you want to, you could just stay focused on this. Ooh, I like how it's working, so I'm just going to stay with it. What I'm trying to do is 3 20-minute drawings today. 3 20-minute studies where we will take it as far as we can in terms of analyzing big shapes, simple shapes, and the value of those shapes. So what I'm doing is I'm just going over, just a little bit over, darkening, no pressure, very light pressure. It takes patience. Kind of like the patience of a cat. Not every cat, but most cats. Some cats that I've seen. Very zen. And it's remembering that your fingers, how hard you're squeezing your pencil, that's how much pressure you're putting into it. I'm going into the edges, and you notice how immediately I get a little bit darker. So what I did is I switched from a 2H, which was a very light pencil, to now a little bit darker lead, which is allowing me to, with the same amount of pressure, get much darker lines. And I'm just going over, cross-hatching before I begin to blend. And I am going to do a little bit of blending very quickly. Just as I continue analyzing and breaking down some of these edges, some of these lines. But squinting is your friend. Squinting a lot is your friend. Bringing in a little more. Notice that it's a little bit spaced out. There's a little more space. There's a little more paper in between each line. So notice that here they're more saturated, they're closer, they're denser, they're darker. Here I'm leaving a little bit of space, a little bit of paper in between, and here it's super dense. Most of them are straight lines, but you could be scumbling. You could be adding lines as you see them. And I don't see that. I just added it to show you. But you could begin to add little lines, little squiggles, and the shapes, as they get more and more complex, making sure you preserve some of that light. One thing you cannot do is not look at your reference. Must be looking at your reference at least 90% of the time in order to get anywhere near. So even when you do these lines, you're doing them almost blind, meaning you're not looking at your paper, you're looking at the reference, and you're trusting the placement when you take one quick peek as you see it come back. So here's what I'm going to do next. I have this paper blender, and in the areas where I need to blend and soften some of this, all I do is I use my finger, and as if I were blending with my finger, I just press it down. Now, once again, pressure, absolutely key, crucial here. I want it soft as long as possible. If you go too hard, you are harming the paper. You're flattening out that beautiful tooth that we talk about, that texture of the paper. And you're pretty much painting with graphite now at this moment. You can always come back, always get a darker pencil and bring it out. Now, blending is a skill that you need to practice and develop, because you're rubbing paper on paper basically, and the graphite's just getting in the way. So the way you manipulate that, the way you can get the most out of the texture of the blender plus the texture of the paper and have the graphite respond, you only learn it by actually doing it. And if you've done it before, there's always something new to learn. I guarantee it. And you do that also by experimenting. There we are. Just like magic, it boom pops up. And there's new areas where I will go back. And if I need to, I will go to a darker pencil for my next stage. So I would go to a 4B or a 6B. And I would do this gradually, continuing with the contour, the curvature of these lines. As I add more lines, and I could just switch over, add a little bit of line, blend them in. Now the way you blend, it's not up and down straight lines. You could actually curve. So since we're dealing with a sphere, a ball, in terms of the eye, you want to kind of have that curvature as you blend that in. And all you have to do to finish this up is select a few lines and try to just copy them. Where do they start? Where do they end? And the less you have to do this, if you could do this with 3 lines, 4 lines, 5 lines, the better. The more you have to add, the more it begins to be overcooked. So the more you minimize the amount of lines, and of course I'm exaggerating, just 5, but let's say, a couple dozen here and there. So instead of doing 100 right here, I could just get away with maybe 12. And not that you have to count them, but you have to get a sense of how much is too much. You'll definitely know when is not enough, but it is a harder thing. It is actually the hardest thing for you to realize that's it. That's the stop. That's the moment to stop. They say in art, that is one of the hardest things. As an artist, you are the only one that makes the call. What is that call? Finished. When is it finished? Only you know. Adding just a little extra sharpness in here. And just for fun, I'm going to bring in a little bit of eraser and just notice how I could bring back, by drawing lighter, sharper, streaks of individual hairs. So all these different ways, bringing some right back into the eye, make this highlight extra white, and bring in another one and that third one here. And I could soften the edge a little bit. Another beautiful thing, the amount of pressure that you could use with your eraser. Just like with the pencils, you want to not erase, but draw with it. And there we have it. Could I add more lines to this? Of course I could. But I think our goal is met. As you just continue adding, you run the risk of taking it just a little too far too quick. So it's best to give it a little extra breathing time, a little space, a little distance. Look at it from 6 feet away, and then you'll have much clearer and a better idea of how much more it needs. Ooh, but I think that looks pretty good. Actually, very happy with it. We're going to move to the next. So you have the images. If you want to continue working with this, just go ahead. There's always the video. You'll always have the video to go back and revisit and finish this one or the one we're about to do later. So one thing I'm doing here is I'm just blending, softening up the background just for composition. So it's not just floating, just adding a little bit here at the edges. And I could go back to my lighter pencil and just add a few extra bits of fur. So beautiful cats. So for our next image, I selected the nose. Beautiful little nose. Going back to my 2H pencil. And I'm going to do the same process. I am going to look at the biggest thing first. So the biggest thing I see is kind of a triangle. I look at the angle of that triangle in order to get a better idea. And there it is. It starts somewhat like this. It begins to get a little rounder in certain areas. So I see a main divide, a little line right here that it goes, kind of splits it right through the middle. There's a little curvature that takes it back. And one of the main things I want to show you here is how we develop the three-dimensionality of these beautiful little elements that we can see when we look up close. And that is, you see how there is sort of a front, a top, and sides to all of the little wings here of the nostrils. So I see the light up top. I see a little more shade here in this, which would seem to be the front. And then I have two very distinct value changes, which are right here at the very, very tip of the nostril. And it rounds right in all the way to the top and comes back down this way as well. So depending on how big I see that, how small I see that, I want to make sure I get a good read. And now we take it onto the other side where I also see a little bit of edge and some value changes. Because in the end, that's what we're looking for. We're looking for the just elementary, basic shapes, how we can simplify them. So you begin to see me really trying to simplify circles, triangles, before I try to add any type of detail. And that's the whole, remember, that's the whole goal today. Even though these are details, very, very detailed details, the eye and the nose of a cat, I want you to stay in a mode of no detail. No detail, never. You must feel like you're not doing detail, you're just adding smaller and smaller elements, shapes, as you work your way down from biggest to medium to smallest. And that's all it is. As you look at the lighter or darker value of the shape, but not to get caught up in detail. Meaning, oh, but how I want to paint all these little hairs. No, you want to, again, let it kind of build up from bigger to smallest. And when they get too small, you just take a look and say, well, actually, look, it just came together without me having to add any. Right now, I'm just adding one first layer of value, still with the 2H. And what that is sort of a general value throughout this entire shadow area. And I know that I could come back over and make it darker. So I'm going over the entire thing. There's a little bit of a lighter effect here. And I'm just looking for, again, squinting, closing one eye, everything that shows up darker in my read. As soon as I squint, I see all the darkest darks first. That's what I want to do. And just freely, loosely, I try to match the shape of it. How? Right now I'm just using a parallel hatch. I think I'm going to move over to this darker pencil, my 2B, in order for me to add a little darker layer. Just a little darker layer. And building it up little by little. This is going to be a crucial one as I bring how dark my darkest value is going to be. And that sense of detail begins to kind of, or yeah, just I feel it like I want to. Nope, stay simple, stay big. Stay simple, stay big. Just manage the values, manage the shapes. And you see how it begins to come together. Now, at some point, you may say, "Well, it looks too geometric." Well, our job is then to polish up the shapes just a little bit. And the way you do that is look at the value, begin to darken, as long as you stay within the frame of that shape that you're focused on. So you do not want to lose focus. As you get smaller, the tendency is usually that, to want to focus on just one little area and develop all the detail in there. No, you want to look at the whole section as one big element. And now I'm just breaking my line, or the hatch. And notice that instead of adding fur, I'm just adding kind of a hatch motion. And the reason I'm doing this is I'm going to blend that. I'm going to come over, I'm going to blend it, knowing that I will be adding just a few extra lines here and there for that sense of detail, for that dramatic effect that makes it look finished. And I think already it's at this stage right here, it begins to become very recognizable. We can see, oh, okay, that's a feline nose, and I could see it's kind of facing this way and tilting down, and the light is coming from this direction. So that's generally speaking what you want at this point. From here, it's just how much more in that spectrum of likeness we could have this become an abstract drawing. Now that would not make us happy, or maybe it would. But in that spectrum from all the way abstract to all the way photorealism, you must land somewhere, and your technique has to match it. Otherwise you won't be satisfied. So if you want photorealism, then you have to strategize and follow the techniques that will get you to photorealism. If you want likeness, somewhat in a, rendering, definition, sketching, trying to see how I put that. But you get my idea. There's a range, a spectrum, somewhere in there. The decision is, how much detail do I need to add in order for me to be fully satisfied with the end product? So you have a vision of what you want it to look like. You need to strategize what is the best approach technique that will get me there. So this was just blending what was there, adding volume to it, blending some of that graphite. That will then, I'll give it a second pass here in my darkest area. Some of these lines that I had going on here, when I blend them, they disappear. So how do I not do that? Well, it's a tough trick. You want to blend them. So in order for you not to waste your time and do double the work, you need to anticipate that. Well, I'm going to be blending, so all that line work is going to be wasted. So then I shouldn't do it until now, after I blended. So then now I could add a few of these lines, as you could see them here, and just a few of them will create that sensation, that likeness, that texture that I'm looking for. And it is necessary, sometimes beyond the value that you create with just blending, that extra contrast, that extra texture that comes from sharper lines. So having those sharp lines pop up, and then it's a matter of which is the best line that will serve. So in this case, I'm using, you notice here, trying to match the shapes of the black that are in this area. And they're very broad. You have lots of white hair over the dark area. So what I'm doing is I'm doing the opposite. I'm just building up dark, leaving some white spaces in the middle to create that furry texture. And now I'm just going a little bit as dark as I can, not as hard with pressure, but just in the areas that I see as blackest, just adding that little bit of extra directional line. And we do have some little swatches right here that just, I think, could be developed with line, blend, and then more line, very softly. And I might benefit from switching back over to my 2H. And just adding a little more. So all of these are broken. Would seem like the parallel hatch, but they're fine. They're thinner, they're lighter. So it begins to, just by following the direction of those hairs, it creates that volume. And just adding a little more for the background, blur. There we have it. So we have our eye, we have our nose, and oh wow, those were two 20-minute drawings. So I'm going to do one final one. And this is going to be our Fool Kitty. So now that we know how to do an eye, we know how to draw an eye and a nose, we are going to flip the page over. And now this is just a quick study, quick sketch. You know there's not going to be a lot of chance to develop, and I don't want you to. That's the idea today, to develop a lot of detail. You could actually just squint at this, get a good sense, and I see it immediately. So the first thing I see is this oval. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger so my composition might change. And notice how I'm doing that. I'm just getting a good sense, because I want you to have that freedom, the feeling of the freedom to sketch freely, where you're not hesitating, you're connecting with the subject. Now, if you look closely, there's another big shape here. I want to get a good sense of it. And it just goes from here to here. And it tops off here at a different value. So I just pencil that in. Not harshly, just to tone it in so I know where I am. And this is called mapping it out. Kind of building our scaffold, our structure, and how we're going to develop the later stages. One thing I do recommend is keeping your lines consistent. That means if I'm using lines to build in value that are somewhat, let's say, 15 degrees left to right, to do it consistently. So when I come over to this area, for example, and I try to do a little bit of value development, if the lines read consistent, if they're pretty much always in the same direction, your drawing is going to be a little bit stronger. It's going to read less confusing. But again, there are no rules. You can make a drawing with all kinds of inconsistent lines and it could work. So here I want to simplify this. The way I do that is I see it as its simplest shape. So I want to make sure I get the angle, the size, and obviously it's just a triangle. And I see it kind of in that direction. So I look at the point and I look how it lines up with the bottom. So is the point way out here or is it in the middle? It's actually a little more this way. So if you look at the bottom where it connects with the head and you look at that as a point, is that line vertical? Not really. But in the angle, it rounds. So the tip of that triangle is now lined up almost right over that point. It's not further out and it's not deeper in. Does that make sense? I hope it does because it's an important one. That's called triangulation. You want to make sure that points relate to the others. So for example, when I look at this point and I visualize a line, does it point right over to this side for my next point? Is it above it? Is it below it? And you can connect these dots just like that. You also look at negative space. If you know how to use all these tools, then you make the best of them. So they serve you and they help you gain more confidence for you to draw with more pleasure, to make it fun. So I haven't even done any details and I'm already happy. I'm already happy with this. So what would be the next thing here? I want to look at this shape and I see this shape coming in. So I'm looking at right below and right below this ear. I'm looking at a shape that almost wants to build up and triangulate down. And I mean triangulate almost to a tip of a triangle, but it's interrupted here by this little, guess what? Another triangle. You can simplify these forms and it is the best way for you, absolutely the best way for you to be sure before you go anywhere near what you call detail. Simplify the angles, simplify the lines. So I see a couple of smaller shapes here. They're round. I want to visualize them and I want to see them and I want to see how they connect to this other element. And generally speaking, we could start, and if someone were to look at my drawing right now, I guess 9 out of 10 2-year-olds would say it's a cat. Or it's going to be a cat. that's where we want to be right now. There's no need to be further than that. And now I'm going to another big measurement here that takes us into what I will develop as value, and eventually, wow, there's a big area here. So there's a little shift in this. And I'm looking at the white and let's call it that sepia tone, that orange hair, where it lands, how it curves, and where it matches with the other elements. So here we are. Now I come to big moment. And why did I wait so long to put these in? Well, these are such important. Shouldn't I have started with the eyes first? Well, I wanted to make sure that everything else was in its proper place, because this is such an important focal point that you would not want to rearrange everything else to them, but them to everything else. Doesn't that make sense? Now that I know everything else is in place, it is much easier for me to place the centerpiece, the focal point, in its proper place. Now, most people would actually start with the eyes. And does that work? Well, then you're doing something right, but there's a lot of risk in that. There's more chance of maybe misproportion or a mismeasurement that could then cause you headaches later down the line and force you to rearrange bigger things, meaning bigger shapes that could have been easier or solved easier early on. So there we have it. I'm there. Now I'm ready to go at it. And let's say again, the detail thing. I first want to look at the direction of the hair, see if I can develop something with the consistency of line. And I'm just going to look at value. I'm beginning to look at the shape, muscle, bone structure. But overall, I just want to develop this. So I'm looking at the direction of the hair more than anything. Notice that this is going this way. So I just fill in my value following the direction of that. And it could shift. Now this one's going this way, this one's going upwards. So I'll go ahead and do that. And that is going to help me give it that character, that personality. I'm going to sharpen some of these edges. The value is a lot lighter, so I'll stay away from there. And there's a little bit of shift in direction here, which, wow, immediately it gives it that nice, just that expression, the look of it. And you see, as I just continue with this, I could take it much, much looser without too much consideration for that hair direction thing that I was talking. It is very valuable to do that. It does build up a proper layer early on. Following the direction of the fur is probably the thing you want to focus on the most when you draw cats, dogs, horses, birds, things that have those type of patterns. Hair, obviously, in a portrait, you want to follow kind of the way it grows. And what I'm trying to do here is maintain that sketching mode where I'm just doing a study. And the study is more about shapes, value, as I just let it develop. So we've done a nose before. This becomes a little easier for us now. I see the shape, the three-dimensionality of it. I see the shifting in the values. I haven't even touched my 2B pencil. So I'm just minimizing getting to those smaller shapes and trying to really just capture the value of those smaller shapes in the right place. And I feel the angle of this one's just a little bit off. It's a beautiful little nose. So I want to make sure I go back over. And I may just be rushing at this point, which I don't want to do. I don't recommend. Notice that these lines are not straight outlines. They're more little broken lines made out of edges of hair that become a little longer as it curves out. And we have a nice little beautiful patch of, once again, looking at that value, little broken patch here. We have a few more value changes, very minimal, right in here. That also helps us create that curvature. A little bit of shifting value, very light in the white areas of fur right in here, down on this side, and that'll be done with the blender. So I'm just guessing how much graphite with 2H do I need in order for me to create that. But before I do that, I want to get to the eye. So I have these beautiful highlights. I'm going to preserve that. Then I'm going to try to capture the shape of the pupil. And one more tiny little highlight that is just a little bit further. So once again, I look at the top and the bottom of the eye, and I measure the distance, the thickness of that pupil. I'm going to add just a little more graphite around the edges. You see how it darkens at the edges. But the most important thing is the reading of the light. Once you see what the light is doing there, and you capture that, you are in good shape. So here I'm going to go around the edges and bring in some of that little bit of light. Notice the change. What we had there early on, I barely even have to bring in any other pencil marks. It's amazing how blending and layering as a technique, it makes you such a great, just your drawing gives you a much better understanding. And it is because you are working mostly with values, with light. So you have to deal with light. It means you're dealing with the one thing that pretty much makes or breaks. Bringing it back out. Now the most important thing here is to make sure you're following the curvature of some of these muscle bone structures, and if you could see the shadows, to make sure you don't just go up and down, and just do a nice good painting job on it. Going to my 2B and just adding pops of darker graphite and some of those final finishing touches with line, especially here in my focal point. So now my lines get a little bit smaller. They get shorter, they get darker, they get sharper. And finally, where there may be a few more steps to this, squinting, I see all these little changes. So I'm just squiggly lines, broken squiggly lines, changing the value of them wherever I see them. And it's hard to say not to, well, how is this not detail? Well, as much as you can, with the mindset of not doing that. You try your best to keep breaking down smaller and smaller, staying focused on individual shapes without getting too carried away in just one little area. And just take it as far as you think it needs to go. And for me, for right now, this is going to be it. Well, just a few more right here. But again, following some of those methods, realizing how they can help you improve your technique for drawing, biggest to smallest, simplest to more complex, and lightest to darkest. And the biggest, most important element of all, patience. So I hope you guys enjoyed this one. That was a lot of fun.